Hello, everyone. My name is Jessica McCurdy, and welcome to the talk, Toward Balanced Long-Termism. I'm excited to introduce to you today Nick Beckstead. Nick Beckstead has been a program officer for the Open Philanthropy Project since 2014. He oversees a substantial part of Open Philanthropy's research and grant making related to global catastrophic risk reduction. Previously, he led the creation of Open Phil's grant-making program in scientific research. Prior to that, he was a research fellow at the Future of Humanity Institute and at Oxford University. Nick Beckstead discusses how we can have a principled and ethical view that values the long-term future without underemphasizing the importance of the near term. We may have time for a brief Q&A at the end, but Nick has volunteered to continue the discussion in Gathertown afterwards. We invite you to use the swap card platform during the session. On the right side panel, feel free to share your thoughts and questions during the talk. And we invite you to use swap card afterwards to set up meetings with fellow conference attendees. Without further ado, welcome, Nick Beckstead.
Thank you very much for the introduction. The first time I encountered a compelling presentation of what I now call long-termism was when I read Nick Bostrom's essay, Astronomical Waste. In that essay, he argues that the chief goal for utilitarians should be to reduce existential risk. I'm going to give a kind of whirlwind summary of that argument because it's going to serve as context for a lot of the rest of the talk. So the basic form of that argument is, suppose humans or our descendants will eventually colonize the Virgo supercluster with its 10 to the 13th stars. Each star, the argument goes, could on average sustain a population the size of Earth or much larger on average. And those stars could sustain civilizations for billions of years. Then Bostrom says this would imply that the potential for 100 trillion potential human beings is lost for every second of postponement of colonization of our supercluster. I'm not going to walk through the reasons. You can check it out at Astronomical Waste to see the original essay. He continues and argues, because the lifespan of galaxies is measured in billions of years, whereas the timescale of any delays that we could realistically affect would rather be measured in years or decades, the consideration of risk, i.e. whether we make it to that point at all, trumps the consideration of opportunity cost. For example, a single percentage point of reduction of existential risks would be worth, from a utilitarian expected utility point of view, a delay of over 10 million years. Therefore, if our actions have even the slightest effect on the probability of eventual colonization, this will outweigh their effect on when colonization takes place. For standard utilitarians, priority number 1, 2, 3, and 4 should consequently be to reduce existential risk. The utilitarian imperative, maximize expected aggregate utility, can be simplified to the maxim, minimize existential risk. Close quote. So those premises of Bostrom's could reasonably be debated in a lot of ways and are perhaps too aggressive in some. Is space colonization even possible? How many stars will we really colonize? Should we just calculate this like total utilitarians? What average population will be sustained per star? How likely is it that we'll really survive as long as for these billions of years? But having considered many variations of this kind of argument myself, I think the broad strokes are plausible enough to, when incorporating uncertainty and expected value, leave the kind of broad strokes about what would be utilitarian priorities roughly intact. I think the format of the conclusion could also be altered some, decreasing the odds of drastic curtailments of human potential as defined in existential risk does not obviously outweigh the importance of decreasing the odds of moderate curtailments of human potential, such as having a future with slightly wrong values realized or having some large fraction of resources be controlled by an authoritarian state. But I think when one adjusts for all of these considerations, a generalization of the conclusion remains intact. Something like the imperative maximize expected aggregate utility reduces to make the long-term trajectory of civilization go best in expectation. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to focus mostly on existential risk for simplicity. I think it's a little cleaner, and the general conclusion is easier to more crisply state, and it won't affect the kind of principles that I'm wanting to work with. So that's my brief rendition of the classic argument that got me interested in long-termism. And I think it still has a kind of simple elegance and appeal. But one issue that I think is that has always been the hard thing to grapple with for this argument, at least for me, is this kind of disturbingly extreme implications of it. So if one takes seriously that each second of delay of technological progress results in the loss of 100 trillion potential lives or something comparably valuable, um, and and small effects on existential risks have even greater consequences, then it becomes natural to ask questions like, could it be justified to do acts that would ordinarily be quite evil to advance those types of goals? Why shouldn't society be approximately 100% optimized for those goals, leaving more conventional concerns as essentially mere instruments in service of progress and existential risk reduction? To clarify, I don't think Bostrom is an extremist in this way, and I'm not saying that he is. But I think it's important to think about how that type of extremism could be avoided and whether it should be, and what alterations to the kind of normative foundations, say, starting from the basic tools of total utilitarianism and expected utility theory, could prevent that. The goal of this talk is not going to be to assess or defend or explain the empirical logic of the argument more than I already have. For the sake of the analysis, I'm going to agree with the story about space colonization, the number of lives at stake, and the rough framing that in terms of total utilitarianism and expected utility, our effects on the long-term trajectory of civilization dwarf everything else. But the game I want to play is I want to take those assumptions and see if we can alter them in some ways that blunt the two types of extremist implications I gestured at. The potential for evil acts done in the name of greater good and potential for too extreme sacrifices for the current generation for future generations, while keeping the long-termist case for minimizing existential risk intact. Somehow holding on to the view that this is extremely important because of the vast number of lives, the vast amount of potential for future lives that's at stake. And I also want to avoid watering down long-termism in unprincipled ways while I do it. So I would like to avoid especially violations of principles of impartiality between current and future people. So it's very much a philosophy talk. It's not about what the existential risks are or how large they are, or how true that empirical story is. It's more like, if you kind of take that for granted, is there something we can do to sort of blunt the extremist implications in a principled way? I think long-termists can make progress towards these goals by taking some pages out of the non-consequentialist playbook. To borrow some language that Thomas Nagel and Samuel Scheffler, the philosophers Thomas Nagel and Samuel Scheffler have used, I think we can leave some space for constraints and options in morality. So by constraints, I mean rules that limit the scope of acts that can be done for the greater good, especially in this context for the sort of long-term future. And often the kind of connotation of these is they're rules that rule out acts of that would be evil in some way, like deception or violence and that kind of thing. And options would be rules that limit the demands that can be placed on us by consequentialist considerations. So they're rules that give us permission to do things sometimes that wouldn't have the best consequences. And I'm going to leave open what the ultimate foundation for some of these rules are. So you could be a kind of rule consequentialist that thinks these things emerge out of that. It could be some kind of contractualist, non-consequentialist that thinks these things emerge out of that. You could be a kind of hardcore act consequentialist who thinks that these things are sort of pragmatically useful. And these are all, I'm going to leave open what the justification is, but those are going to be the tools that I'm going to try to work with and the goals I'm going to try to achieve in the talk. So starting with constraints, non-consequentialists like Thomas Nagel and Samuel Scheffler have used the word constraint, as I've said, to refer to the kind of common sense rules that prohibit us from doing the things that would have the best consequences. A kind of standard thought experiment that comes up here is organ harvesting. So it's kind of graphic, weird philosophy thought experiment, but you could imagine a case where killing person A would make it possible to transplant their organs to 5 other people and save 5 lives. And you can ask, is it wrong to kill person A? Most people hold that it would be wrong to kill in this kind of example, even if one could be assured of not being caught. But not everyone says that. Ethicists, roughly speaking, have kind of responded to this case in a number of ways, sometimes claiming that there are consequentialist reasons that are sort of non-obvious, that explain why one should not kill in this kind of case. Maybe it's best to have a society that has rules against that kind of behavior. Maybe it has best consequences to be the kind of person who follows those kinds of rules. Or maybe just trying to identify exceptions to rules like this generally has bad consequences. And there's kind of variations on this type of thing. So that's we can call that kind of consequentialist reductionism. It sort of takes the common sense datum and explains it in some consequentialist friendly way. It's another kind of approach that claims that there are non-consequentialist reasons that we should not kill in this case. Maybe there's just certain fundamental moral principles. Maybe one considers a certain type of social contract, like contractualists would, and that says, everyone would agree to a contract in which these things are forbidden in a certain kind of situation. That's another kind of approach to making sense of this. And then third is a kind of bullet biting approach. It just says, well, maybe most of the time it wouldn't be okay, but if you sort of assure me that it's truly as your thought experiment says, then maybe it is, despite conventional attitudes to the contrary. So they're kind of like three types of responses. I think one can consider analogs of things like organ harvesting for long-termists, where one can do some nasty thing X for the sake of reducing existential risk, and per the thought experiment, it works. You get away with it, existential risk is reduced. I think long-termists can kind of respond in the same family of ways. And I think we should think about these things and maybe flag them a little bit more than we normally do. As reductionists, non-consequentialist constraint holders, or, biting the bullet. I think there are a lot of plausible things you could say about reductionism and non-consequentialist constraints. And the main thing I want to say is that I think we shouldn't be bullet biters, if nothing else on pragmatic grounds. I think there would be wide agreement among long-termists that it would have bad consequences for the official position of intense long-termists to be that it's ethically permissible to do terrible things to advance long-termist objectives. If nothing else, because of the kind of rough argument that when people do try to identify exceptions to these rules, it tends to have bad consequences, or if nothing else, because it's just bad diplomacy for long-termists as a group. But I also think the other kinds of just the consequentialist or non-consequentialist bases could also be quite plausible. I think there's some kind of interesting distinctive features that arise when one thinks about long-termism and constraints. And that also sort of gets for me to the heart of what's weirdest about bullet biting in this case. So normally, I think morality plays this important dispute resolution function of kind of having generally accepted rules that people use to get along with each other. And normally, utilitarian morality can't be arbitrarily decoupled from dispute resolution because the disputants are normally all part of the same reciprocally interacting scene. And what's in fact good for people tends to only stray so far from what most people say they want. But in a long-termist context, almost all of the relevant moral patients, the people we can affect and whose interests matter, are currently not yet alive. And what's good for them is inherently speculative. So there is in principle a great deal of scope for intense unilateral action done in the name of future people by currently existing moral agents. I think that's a kind of inherently unstable situation that sort of undermines the kind of dispute resolution function of morality. And I think it's important that we find ways to maintain that. So without trying to sort of say what the ultimate way is, I kind of want to point at this as a problem and say that it's a thing that I think long-termists should be thoughtful about and try to think about how they're going to maintain that. I'm going to move on to the other aspect of this, the option side of it. By way of introducing it, I'm just going to say a little bit about Peter Singer's famous pond thought experiment and reactions to that moral philosophy. So famously, one finds a child drowning in a pond while walking through a park. To save the child, one must ruin an expensive pair of shoes. Singer argues that we ought to do it. Singer then argues that saving children from dying of malaria and other diseases is relevantly analogous to rescuing children from ponds, and that the scope for saving lives through donations is essentially unlimited. One could spend all of one's money on the Against Malaria Foundation, stopping only when the next dollar did as much good for oneself as donating to charity. It's commonly objected that this is too demanding a conception of morality. Can't I be a good person while doing less? And there's a big sub-literature in philosophy devoted to the question. So some of the answers vary. Some of them are, there's kind of strict libertarians on one hand, who might say something like that nothing is required. One can walk past, even in the regular pawn case. If you didn't push them in, you don't owe anything. There's some that agree with Singer, saying that we should indeed keep sacrificing until not sacrificing has worth consequences. And then there's a much broader distribution of attempts to draw lines between them, saying that some amount of sacrifice is required, but we have the option to stop, far short of making consequentialist optimal sacrifices. So here I'm reminding you, I'm using the word option in this special sense that it's like a permission to do something that's suboptimal from a consequentialist point of view. An interesting difference with Singer-style demandingness embracers and long-termists, a kind of hypothetical long-termist demandingness embracer, is that a Singer-style demandingness embracer can say, if everyone did their duty, it would not be that expensive to take care of all of the world's poor. But we're living in an emergency, and others are not doing their duties, so I must do it for them. So it's a plausible and perhaps even a noble reply. I think there's something disturbingly and interestingly different that I haven't fully processed how to think about in the case of the long-termist version of this problem. So for long-termists, there's a civilization-wide kind of demandingness objection that can take place. One can imagine for a moment what a world fully populated by ardent long-termists would look like. And I think there's things to appreciate about it, to be sure. Civilization would be much more likely to flourish over astronomical timescales. Civilization would prioritize a fast rate of technological progress, and perhaps, even just a couple generations out, most people would be better off. There would be a shared project to realize something that would be larger than all living people with tremendous upside. On the other hand, if everyone took utilitarian, excellent opportunities to help future people, the current generation would really be at the mercy of empirical questions like what arrangement of society minimizes existential risk? And subject to that constraint, what sub-arrangements maximize the rate of technological progress? And we would only then really start asking, except as mere instrumentation, which arrangements of society are best for the people who currently live. With 100 trillion potential lives on the line, with every second of frivolous delay, one imagines that there would be less time for ice cream and vacations. Yes, perhaps a happy worker is a good worker, but the work schedule that optimizes for output is often not the work schedule that optimizes for personal fulfillment, as many junior investment bankers could explain to you. I think that there's a very plausible intuition that this would be too much to ask of people. At the very least, I imagine if we put forward a version of long-termism that had this as its logical conclusion, many would flinch away from it as unpalatably extreme. And it's really hard to imagine a society that thoroughly imbibed and acts on this extreme view. It feels like it's kind of, if one takes it seriously, something that at most a small subset of people could ever be really into. So it seems also relevant when thinking about this that one could get a very large percentage of the possible gains of enacting fully long-termist policy with much smaller sacrifices from people. So for example, Toby Ord argues in his recent book that there's about a 1 in 6 chance of human extinction in the next century, and that the risk of human extinction from natural disasters is only about 1 in 1,000. Since most of the risk is of our own making, it seems like it would take far less than 50% of society's resources to reduce the total risk by 50% or even 90%. So it seems especially like a lot to ask to a first approximation to optimize primarily for minimizing existential risk when it seems like we could get most of the benefits with so much less. So that's my framing of the kind of special long-termist demandingness problem. I want to now talk about some possible responses to it. Now, I think the first thing to appreciate is that it's not immediately straightforward how one can escape the conclusion in a principled way, especially if one wants to hold on to the kind of impartiality that I gestured toward at the beginning of the talk. if 100 trillion future lives depend on each second of delay of technological progress, how can we, with a straight face, argue that we're being fair and impartial to future people if we're not willing to make quite epic sacrifices for them? I think, one way to get at how you could try to get around this in a relatively unprincipled way. So, for example, you could propose a compromise between the current generation and all future generations. Maybe in some yet to be formalized sense, we should act in, say, a 50-50 compromise between the interests of the current generation and future generations, or some 90-10 split, or whatever passes our intuitive bar for not being too demanding. I think the obvious issue with this approach is just framed is that it doesn't seem appropriately impartial and respectful to future people. Why should the interests of these 8 billion people alive today receive so much more weight than the interests of all unborn future people? Well, it might get the long-termists a very large percentage of everything they want and still render long-termist goals the most important issues that are alive today. It would feel a bit too similar to saying something like, we'll give 50% of the power to the nobles and 50% of the power to the commoners, because we don't want to be too extreme and give everything to the nobles. So that's a kind of rough gesture. I think a lot more could be said about it, but this talk is more about like putting issues to our consciousness than sort of proposing total solutions to them. An alternative that I find somewhat appealing is to say that while it would have the best consequences to maximize the hell out of the efficiency and existential safety of the global economy, it's not morally required for people alive today. So it's a kind of options-based exemption that I'm going to try to say could get us out of this. And then I think it's an interesting project to look through, think through the demandingness literature, think through the justifications for options, and see which of the solutions poured over in more or less plausible ways. I'll just say a couple of the thoughts that I find the most promising. This is going to be very programmatic. So one potentially useful insight is that under 100% hardcore long-termism, say something like the total utilitarianism plus expected utility theory, the current generation would probably be worse off than it would be under social contracts that make no compromises at all with past or future generations. There's a tradition in contractualism of trying to make sure that the social contract is justifiable to each participant. And perhaps something like that could be exploited to specify a maximally justifiable amount that could be owed to future generations. The philosopher David Gautier has a version of contractualism that could be interesting to consider here. It has a kind of mechanism for sort of splitting the surplus over different possible social contracts to different people. And it doesn't do it in a utilitarian way. It does it in a kind of, in a different way that has different properties and kind of allows for a more egalitarian splitting of the possible benefits. So I think it might be unfair to long-termism in his literal version, but perhaps there's some kind of more sophisticated version in that vicinity that could be interesting. Alternatively, I think it might be interesting to kind of give up on giving a systematic answer to this question and sort of treat it more like a matter of the heart. So you could have a view that says, systematic philosophy can perhaps figure out what it would be best to do, but it can't tell us how much we must sacrifice. You might think that you can compare this to kind of like an investor who's trying to make trade-offs between their family life and their home life. And you might be able to give a principled and systematic answer to say what arrangement of my life would maximize my investment returns. But you might think that there's not going to be any systematic answer to the question, how should I manage trade-offs between my personal life and my career success? If one tries to sort of construct a philosophical edifice that answers the question, it might just be no more appealing than a philosophical edifice that says, how to make trade-offs in one's dating life or something like that. And it's kind of a reframing. It's not so much an answer, but it's a reframing of this that I think, could potentially be plausible if we can't kind of give a deep theoretical basis. So I'm going to turn to one objection and then wrap up. So the objection I want to consider is, if there's no firm basis for limiting the demands of future generations, could we not claim that very little is expected of us when it comes to helping future beings and things like existential risks? I think one thing I want to say is that I think it's actually pretty clear that we owe future generations a lot when it comes to minimizing existential risk, even when operating within a kind of more commonsensical, non-consequentialist point of view. Since almost all of the existential risk that will be produced while we're alive will come from nature and not from human activity. So if human potential is utterly destroyed, it's something that the current generation is responsible for. So we would be less like somebody who failed to save a child drowning in a pond, and more like someone who accidentally knocked many children into ponds due to their negligence. And I think we could think about analogies like, did we do enough to secure a nuclear power plant? And I think these types of analogies may be more useful. So I'm running out of time, so I'm going to try to wrap up quickly. I've tried to make a vivid sense in which classic long-termism may be too extreme and explore some avenues to blunting the extremist nature of the position while still maintaining the issues like existential risks as key issues for our time. I think there are a lot of interesting questions to ask about whether these approaches work. Particularly, can the version of contractualism that I suggested work? Can long-termism with its amplified stakes play nice with non-consequentialist notions of options and constraints? And, does this notion of don't increase existential risk work as a kind of baseline to request? But that's all I can get through. I'm going to be around for discussion. If you want to, I can take questions, but thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Nick, for that really thought-provoking talk. We unfortunately don't have any more time for this session, but everyone is welcome to join the Gather Town afterwards and keep the Q&A going there. So thank you again so much for everyone coming.